Well, hey, good evening and welcome everyone. This is Jordan Sins here from the district office. I have 5:30 p.m. and we said we were going to start it promptly at 5:30. So I want to respect everyone's time. I just want to say good evening, welcome. Thank you for being here for our informational presentation regarding the auditorium referendum that's on the ballot for April. So thanks for joining us. And we're just going to jump right into the presentation. Just a few things before we get into the information. Obviously myself, Jordan Sins, the district administrator here in Wisconsin Heights. I have a few other people that are supporting on this call. Jim Weedy and the team for Performance Services, which is the group that we've been working with on the referendum that passed in November. And then Doreen Dembski worked with us actually last summer and in the fall when we had done previous community meetings like this. Doreen helps out with some facilitation and she will talk about some ground rules and kind of how we're going to proceed with the question portion of the meeting tonight here, and she'll share that shortly. Just a real basic purpose for getting together tonight. First and foremost is to provide attendees with some information about the proposed auditorium. It's to gather some questions about the information that you hear tonight to see if there's other things that we can better try to answer or more information that we can seek for community members. And then understanding that, you know, there might be some things that we might not have answers to tonight, but we certainly want to know that in the next couple of weeks, you know, what information can we share and can we get out to community members to help them as we look forward to the vote here in early April, which is just a couple weeks away. I had mentioned that Doreen was going to join us, and before we get into the informational portion, I just wanted to welcome Doreen and let her share kind of some ground rules to make sure that we have good, respectful facilitation of this informational session in question. So Doreen, go ahead and take it away.
Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you for attending tonight. It's very important that everybody has their questions answered. So the way we're going to do this is use the chat box. If you would look at the bottom of your screen, there's a feature called chat. I will be out there monitoring the chat. I will also be possibly interrupting if it's a question that we think is best answered at that point in the presentation, or if there are several of the same kind of question. But most of the questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. So go ahead and enter them there. I'll be monitoring them. And then we'll try to get you the answers in the best fashion possible. We really want to stay tonight on the topic of the auditorium referendum. We're starting and ending on time, so we will answer as many questions as we can by 6:30. Please know that if there is something that you're curious about that we might not have the immediate answer to, that we'll keep track of that and we will get that answer out to you and possibly others. And just so that hopefully this goes without saying, but we want to be respectful so that all voices are heard and all voices are important to this process. So we want to, again, stay on the topic of the auditorium, and so that we can hear from everybody, we're using the chat feature tonight.
Thank you, Doreen. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Jim and the PSI team, I'll turn it over to you for some information on kind of the designs and the concepts.
Go ahead, Chris. Good evening, everybody. Chris Garrity with Performance Services. I'm one of the architects working on the job. So the first piece you see here is the proposed location of the new auditorium. So you can see on the plan here the current elementary school addition coming off of the end of the middle school and the high school then to the south. So we're looking at that new blue box there coming off the north of the current gym. Is the new location for the theater addition. As you can see right now, we're not sitting on top of any parking. If you go to the next slide, we looked at the parking count total. So there's currently 313 stalls on the campus. We are not taking away any stalls as part of any of the projects, so that the 313 stays. And then as part of the elementary school addition, we are adding an additional 73 parking stalls for a total of 386 stalls across the campus. We know the parking was a concern, so we wanted to make sure we maximize the parking available.
Yeah, Chris, I just want to piggyback the parking thing real quick. With that number at 386, we've run our historical analysis, and there's usually around 85 to 95 permits that are given for student parkers or student drivers to park their vehicles. And then even with the single campus as of September of 2022, we're right around 135 staff members. So the notion of with everyone here in a normal day and those same number of students with parking permits and every staff member driving individually, we're at about 240, meaning we'd still have 145 approximately available stalls during the school day. So I just wanted to point that out as well, is that we will not be at capacity during a typical day for sure.
And then moving to the inside of the proposed auditorium addition, you can see again in blue, we're looking at a new entrance vestibule for the middle high school and athletics on the left-hand side. So that'll start to serve all of the functions. The nice thing about this location is it does get to piggyback some of the other spaces there to really create a public-facing portion of the building. And then the auditorium area is looking at a 500-seat auditorium. It's going to have a sloped floor with ramps to get to the stage, so everything will be ADA accessible. In addition to the regular seat auditorium, there will be an orchestra pit, a true stage there, and then behind the stage, all of the support spaces. So dressing rooms, scene shop, and then some storage space on the second floor. In addition to serving all this, we'll have a light booth with the typical auditorium lighting, as well as a sound booth and some additional storage. On the vestibule side, we'll also have some public restrooms, knowing that that's going to be used as intermission space. So as during intermission, there is an opportunity to use the restrooms without accessing the rest of the building, so we can secure that separately.
Thanks, Chris. Are you good?
Yep. And then the next image is just a proposed interior rendering of what it could potentially look like for that new auditorium.
Just before we get into any other information, just wanted to talk about some of the themes of interest. And when I say themes of interest, some things that have come up from some online feedback that we've seen or from previous questions that we've received. So the first one was parking and then bus flow. So I think the parking piece in terms of no stalls being taken up, plus an additional 73 being added to the lot, that helps to answer that question. In terms of bus flow, the pickup drop-off location for the elementary school will be in front of that entrance. The middle school, high school, that area will not be like filled in or covered by the building. We haven't decided on all of the logistics exactly, but we are planning on a staggered start and end time to minimize the traffic concerns and to avoid any issues with bus flow as well. There were some questions regarding the size and 500 seats. I guess one of the first key things that I learned in my last school district, which was of similar size to Wisconsin Heights, is we often wanted to run assemblies that were all students in kindergarten through 5th grade. So your elementary school students or your students in grade 6 through 12, your middle school, high school students. In a district of our size, just under 800 students, typically, obviously in half, you'd have about 400 students. But then by the time you put staff in there, potentially some parents and visitors, and you're pushing right up against that 500 seat size. And just for, once again, a school our size, you often find that you want to have guest speakers or assemblies in an auditorium rather than potentially a gymnasium. So the size would accommodate for the elementary school children to be together for an assembly or for the middle school, high school as well. there were some questions on enrollment or community growth and kind of where does this fit into that. Our enrollment in the district was on the uptick prior to the pandemic this last year. So we had the enrollment had kind of bottomed out, if you will, around 2015-16, and we were seeing a slow uptick in that enrollment. We had actually done an enrollment study with UW-Madison Population Lab, and they were predicting that would continue for the next decade, and we'd see around 7 to 10% growth in our student population. What happened here in Wisconsin Heights this year during the pandemic is quite typical. 80% of the school districts in the state of Wisconsin lost enrollment this year. It's been hypothesized that most of that enrollment will come back once we're able to resume normal operations. And once again, that's not just for Wisconsin Heights, but that's for the other 80% of the public schools in the state that lost enrollment in the midst of the pandemic this year. There was questions about the legacy walk or the brick walkway. Certainly would be something that we would work with the foundation and find ways to relocate that. It certainly would not just go away. We would find another way to prominently display that walkway and make sure it was done effectively. And then the tax impact, we have multiple slides dedicated to the tax impact later in the presentation. Certainly understand those concerns and people wanting that information. So we will address that in some slides later in the presentation. But just thought for some of these other things, it would be probably better if you had those questions, because there were ones we've seen online, to try to answer them now rather than have you feel like you had to wait 30 minutes to get answers to some of these questions we've seen.
Jordan,
Yes.
just a quick question in the chat. How many buses per day, which is not directly relevant to the referendum, but we did bring it up here.
Well, I mean, I guess the number of buses per day, I can't say how many buses. We typically run around 12 bus routes in a normal day right now. So to say what that would potentially be in 2 years, I'm assuming that number is not going to shift drastically because our enrollment's probably not going to shift drastically. But right now we typically run around 12 routes, full routes.
Thank you.
So part of the project, or leading up to the referendum and being on the ballot, was to try to figure out, make sure that there would be sufficient use. So some surveying was done with staff and some community members as well regarding potential usage. I'm not going to insult people's intelligence by reading directly off a list. Rather, we'll just kind of move through. We put these together by season. Certainly a lot of things that would come and would happen based on the time of the school year. So you can see this is relative to district usage and events that were identified for the fall. And then just very similar then moving through to the other seasons of the year. So uses in the district for the winter. Spring, not surprising, is a very busy time of year as people try to get in performances and programs and things at the class level for music as well. Continuing on the list of uses in the spring season. Some of the activities you'll notice wouldn't just be Wisconsin Heights students exclusively. Large group band and choir festivals typically involve your conference. So in our case, the Capital Conference, FFA speaking competitions, very similar, bringing in students from the region as well, but being able to host those competitions here in Wisconsin Heights. And then other items that were brought up for the possibility of district use year-round. So these wouldn't be things that were just exclusive, to a certain season, but things that would be able to take place in the auditorium on a year-round basis. And then I had mentioned also as a part of the survey, there were some questions to others regarding some potential things in the community. Many of us have probably lived in communities, or if not lived, have traveled to other communities that do have theater/auditorium spaces. So there's other things that could potentially happen that would involve the community. So bringing in productions or events, shows, touring groups, things like that, that once again, having worked in a district of similar size, these were events that did take place with relative frequency in that situation as well. Jim or Chris, I don't know if you want to talk about this and just bring this back to the engineering work and the things that are being done with KL.
Sure, I'll jump back on. KL is our traffic study engineer. They are working, they did an initial traffic study for the property. They determined that the estimated load for the new facilities are safe. There's no concern there. We've had some initial conversations and going through process meetings with the Wisconsin Department of Transportation. At this point, they're aligned with the study, and there's no major concerns with that. They did not indicate that they wanted any sort of traffic light or any other major changes on 14. The current system is working, and that the traffic load did not necessarily warrant anything new or major to the site.
You know, one of the things too, relative to that piece with traffic and parking, is the notion of scheduling and events. And obviously that would be something that we would be very cognizant of if this referendum came to fruition and we had an auditorium on this site. Mr. Pickett, our activities director, would work with our staff members, work with community members, and would ensure that our schedule minimized overlap, and we didn't have situations where we were hosting two large events here at the same time, obviously understanding the concerns there and the limitations, but at the same time with minimal effort in the scheduling arena, those things could be accomplished. So just some information on kind of the timeliness of this all. First and foremost, the school board did take a vote actually in August when they voted to put the November referendum on the ballot. There was two votes that took place that night. One to put the November referendum on the ballot, and that vote from the school board was a 4-3 vote in favor of putting that on the ballot. And there was a second question that was voted on that night, and it was for the auditorium and for that to be on the ballot. And that actually, at that time, did not pass by that same 4-3 vote. So it was very close at that time. The comment was made that the board wanted to focus their energy on the November referendum and on the single site, the elementary school, the updates to the middle school, high school, but they would also consider the possibility that if that was successful, continuing the dialogue regarding the possibility of an auditorium. So as we all know, the referendum was successful in November, and then the board, as they said they would, brought back the conversation and had dialogue on this topic in November and December, and then ultimately ended up having to vote again in January of 2021 to adopt a resolution to include this on the ballot. So just for a little context there. A few other reasons of why the board made that decision in January is there's estimated savings. So we had done some survey work with the community through school perceptions. There was interest in the auditorium. Part of that interest was discussed perhaps pushing that between 2 and 5 years down the road. It's been estimated that the construction savings of doing it now versus 5 years down the road is over $2.2 million just to bring people back to the site. The inflation with projects, increased cost that there would be in 5 years. For us as a school district to have this go on simultaneously versus in 5 years would help minimize disruption to student learning, not having to have the site under construction again for a second time. We were very fortunate, and we'll share more information on this, but we're enjoying historically low interest rates. We locked in the borrowing for the November referendum at an average interest rate of 1.64%. There have been things brought up by community members, and I'm sure you've seen some of these things as well. And we understand those concerns with our existing site, both for performance and for audience members in relation to ADA. And then the other, exciting thing from a school district standpoint is with all students being on this campus as of September of 2022, the notion that our students from pre-kindergarten through 12th grade could enjoy a space like this and could utilize a space like this without having to travel made this appealing as well. And the notion of the auditorium and the possibility of this really is something that started, 4 years ago, when we did our future search, and we had over 90 community members give 12 hours of their time to share some of the things that they wanted us to focus on, and that became our strategic directions for the district that we're still utilizing. In addition to talking about a single campus at that time, there were a lot of community members that just brought up the possibility of an auditorium potentially being there. And then, as I mentioned, this was surveyed, community survey that actually went out basically a year ago. And in that survey, there were questions that pertain directly to the auditorium. So I mentioned the projected tax impacts. So you can see those numbers broken down on this slide. It's important to look at the assumptions here at the bottom. So this is being based off an assumption of an interest rate at 3.25%. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So you can see the breakdown. It's 47 cents per $1,000, which doesn't really equate to a whole lot until you then put it in context of property values that would look more in line with what someone may have actually in the community. Just wanted to share this slide as well, because as you know, and understandably so, there's been concerns about the tax impact, and people recently obviously felt the increase based on the referendum that passed in November. But I just wanted to share this illustration because while we have been very fortunate due to a couple factors, growth in our tax base, residential development is strong in our communities, has been strong for a few years. The fact that our enrollment has stabilized and has grown slowly over the last 4 or 5 years. We had seen this line trending down pretty drastically since 2016-17 in the mill rate for the school district. So if you look at where the mill rate went to after the $27 million referendum was approved in November of 2020, that number actually mirrors the number that the district had in 2016-17. And obviously at that time, there was no $27 million. That was the mill rate basically to run the operations of the school district. So while we certainly felt the impact of the referendum, the number that we're presently at for the mill rate is not an unprecedented number. And as recently ago as 5 years ago, the mill rate was actually higher than it was this last year based on the tax impact from the referendum that passed in November. Talked a little bit about our previous financing experience. So we mentioned that we locked in at a rate of 1.64%. At that time, Baird Financial, or prior to the referendum, was projecting 3.2%. So the good news for the community, for the taxpayer, is based on the initial projections or the pre-referendum projections. This will save the community $4.6 million in interest. There's been a little confusion for some people that this is going to be money that the district has. This is not money that the district has or will have. these savings are going to be realized in the form of less tax collections. So the lower interest rate is going to result in, over the next 20 years, there will be $4.6 million less collected in tax. That is not money that the district will have as a result of benefiting from this lower interest rate. And then take that a step further, the average mill rate impact based on that 3.2% interest rate was projected to be $1.86 for the life of the borrowing. With the rates that we locked in at, it's now projected to be $1.45 for the life of the borrowing. So this 41-cent difference, to kind of equate that back to a mill rate impact for someone that's a homeowner or property owner in the district, if you had a $400,000 property, let's say, this will equate to $164 less in tax collections than what was projected before the vote in November. So timeline, just wanted to kind of share, I'd already mentioned that the board approved the resolution. So that took place on January 25th, 2021. The board approved the resolution to place the auditorium question on the ballot. Since then, you've seen communication. There's been communication on our website. There's been communication on our social media page. A mailer, one page just to remind people of the vote recently went out. There's been information in the district newsletter. Obviously today we are having our community presentation and question and answer. And then, yeah, just a few short weeks away, the spring general election. Post vote, obviously the board will assess those results and they'll either work to finalize a design if it's successful, and if it's not, then they'll have to define kind of future efforts to address the facility and what ways they can try to, try to improve the setting or the situation, if you will, depending on the results of that vote on April 6th. Doreen?
Hi there. I was answering someone's question. Okay, so thank you everybody who's been diligently typing into the chat. I'm going to first ask questions that have more than one person asking about a topic. And I think this one is for Jim and Chris. It is about how the construction costs will affect the overall cost of the project. People are projecting building material increases. They're reporting that we're going through a time of material prices increasing. So how does the cost look when we put out this ask? Is it solid? Is it going to increase? I think people are worried about that.
Sure. So you're very correct. There's been a lot of increases in building materials as of the last, probably 5-6 months or so. Wood being one of the largest one of that. So part of what we do is, as we're tracking these things, we can make decisions early on that address costs. So one, we take a look at those cost numbers and make sure that our budgets cover that. So if we see increases, for example, steel has had some cost increases, so we made sure we tracked that and made sure those dollars were incorporated into that. And then if we can make decisions on things to find materials that cost less, for example, we're proposing either tilt-up or precast concrete panels as the exterior of the building. You don't need windows, so it's a really good application for that material on the inside. So it looks like it'll have brick on the exterior, but still on the inside the precast. That means there's going to be much less steel. Concrete is relatively cheap. There's not been a major cost increase on that. So any of those decisions we can make early on some of those, we can do those to make sure that we're locking in our prices appropriately.
But I want to make sure that the audience here is clear, and Jordan, correct me if I'm wrong, or Jim or anybody. There would be no contracts let for any projects until we have an approved referendum. We are not at that stage. So
correct.
So that's number one. And Jordan, it is true then that the referendum asks the voters to approve a certain amount that you may borrow, and that's what you may borrow. You may not go above that for anything else.
Correct. I mean, whatever is approved is what we have the authority to borrow. So like, for example, in the fall, that number was $27 million. And that's why when you look at that ballot language, it seems to be quite lengthy and includes a lot of different components. And that's because legally that ballot language needs to include the components that would be involved in the project. But in terms of borrowing, yes, that is the borrowing authority that you're granted by virtue of a successful vote. So in that case, 27 million. And if this passed, in this case, it would be 7.5 million.
And Jim, can you talk a little bit to PSI's process for providing these estimates? Do you have anything else to add to that? I've heard this question before. It's a legitimate question people ask. And I think it's important to understand the processes that you use to get these estimates.
Yeah, if the referendum is passed, we'll go out and competitively bid all pieces of the project to local bidders as well as larger non-local bidders. But first we have to wait for the referendum to pass. If it does pass, then we take up our design and then we go out to bid for the project.
So I hope that answers a few of the folks who have been asking questions about in our chat box about material costs and how this would be funded. We have one more question I'd like to, how much are you projecting the maintenance cost to be for the addition or the theater, and what additional staff would be required to run the theater? So is there additional maintenance costs and additional staff required?
So we had worked with PSI on the possibility in terms of operational cost, and the numbers that they ran based on the square footage and kind of what the site would potentially include on the high end. And basically this is if the space is being utilized essentially to full capacity, the operational cost was around $25,000 annually. In terms of additional staffing, we would not, as a district, be looking to hire any additional staff, like maintenance staff in particular, as we condense down to a single campus as of 2022. We will certainly have sufficient staff where we would not be in a position where we would be looking to hire additional staff. And in terms of some of the more technical aspects or things that come with an auditorium or a theater, we would work to train our technology staff internally and then work with groups in the community as well, because there might be some resources, and that's some experience that I've had in previous districts. In addition to your internal IT staff, there's often a few people in that fine arts community that have an interest in some ability and some knowledge in knowing some of those nuances with technology, sound, light, things like that. So no, we would not be looking to add staff.
Thank you, Jordan. Well, we have quite a few questions of the questions that we have received, and I want to make sure we get to the fiscal side of the project. I'm going to try to wrap some of these together as they have similar themes. One question was how long the term would be for borrowing. That was in the slide, 20 years. You showed the tax impact, but there was a question saying over the last several years, you've asked for operating referendums, a referendum to build the elementary school, and now an additional amount to build. I don't know that there's a question in there. There is a comment that says, how do you justify this? Perhaps you'd like to explain the difference between an operating referendum and a bond, a bond referendum first. I think that's important for people to understand. And then perhaps some of this is not related to the auditorium, but it's relatively new. Why wasn't the auditorium part of November? You explained that the board chose not to add it to November, but wanted to do a wait and see. So why is it out there now? What is some of the thought that went on behind just repeating perhaps what you said before? But again, I think it's important for the public to know the difference between an operating referendum and a bond referendum. They're very different.
Yep. So an operational referendum, there can either be a recurring or a non-reoccurring, which in the case of Wisconsin Heights, this isn't a recent phenomenon in the district. The first time that the district attempted to pass an operational referendum was in 2007. It was actually unsuccessful, I believe, in 2007 and 2008. and then an operational referendum was approved in 2009. So the operational referendum really just is what the name implies. It is dollars to help the district operate. So that's day-to-day operations. That's to pay employees to work there. That's to pay for supplies. That's to pay for technology, just to operate on a day-to-day basis. At this point, over 80% of the districts in the state of Wisconsin are operating via or through the support of a local operational referendum. Without getting into questions or concerns on state finance and what that tells us about state finance for public schools, if over 80% of the districts in the state need to go to their local taxpayers to fund operational referendums. But I do think that is indicative of a system that certainly could use a little reworking, but that's not an issue we're going to solve here tonight. So that's an operational referendum. And as I said, those have been attempted here since 2007, were initially unsuccessful, and then have been successful since 2009. The last one having been approved in 2019. It's interesting, or excuse me, it's important to note that in 2019, when we went out for our operational referendum, we went out for 5 years, and we did not increase that dollar amount on an annual basis. We kept that dollar amount at $2.2 million for 5 years, which is actually less than was approved for the previous school year. So we were doing our part, or trying to do our part as a district to keep our operational costs down the best we can. So that's an operational referendum. And in this case, it's a capital referendum. And what a capital referendum does is it asks your community if you can go out and borrow dollars to a certain amount. So in this case, we are asking the community if we could go out to borrow up to $7.5 million. Doreen, I know you had lumped a few other things in there. Was there something else you wanted me to try to address?
Well, I think the theme that's coming through is there's the operating referendum, then the elementary referendum, and now the auditorium, and sort of explaining the logic again, as you did when you went out for the elementary referendum. Part of the logic there was to avoid costs, save some of those operational dollars and combine into one campus. I don't think we have time to get into that, but that's the gist of the question. How do you justify referendum for operating, then for the elementary, and now the auditorium? We're seeing a few of those comments.
Yeah, well, I guess that's not for me to justify. The school board voted 6-1 on January 25th to put this on the ballot. This was something that's been talked about, like I said, for quite some time via surveys and via community feedback. They made their decision in August that they weren't going to include both of them on the November ballot. But then obviously they made a decision in January that they were going to include this on the April ballot. So I really don't have a whole lot to say other than that's just how it played out. And this is something that needed to be approved by a board resolution, and it was.
And then is there any fundraising? A couple of questions related to other sources of revenue for the project. Number one, did you consider any fundraising before asking the voters? And now, what if there were other donations? How would that impact the overall cost of the project to the taxpayer?
Well, I do know that the community arts group that's been pretty active and has been at numerous board meetings in the last 6 months. They have talked about trying to raise dollars to support this cause as well and to minimize the impact to the greatest extent possible. One of the things that they shared at a board meeting was the fact that most of the avenues that they've looked into have said that they are not going to provide funds unless they know a project is happening. So I think that's kind of where they're up against, is for them to apply for some of these grants or some of these funds or donations. The companies, the individuals, whomever it may be, is going to want to know that there's a project happening before they donate dollars. So that piece has certainly been discussed. I don't know what the details are, but I'm sure I know there's members of that group on this meeting, and that could be something that they could address online as well at a certain point because that's something that I know they're working on.
So sort of another fiscal question, do you anticipate COVID relief bill would be allocated and applied to this project?
No, because I do not know how we could utilize funds that are to make up to the disruption in learning that we've experienced as a result of COVID. I do not know the connection that we could make on COVID relief funds and draw a line that was a truthful line between that and the construction of an auditorium facility. The funds do not have a lot of requirements, but they are intended to be used to help make up for learning that was lost as a result of the pandemic.
Jordan, there's a question here, and I know the answer to it. Can it be used to pay down debt for other debt for the projects that are online for the school district? But the COVID relief funds, to my understanding, are to help districts, as you just said, defray the costs or pay back the district for costs and unanticipated costs due to the pandemic, such as switching to virtual learning, such as health, increased cleaning. I don't know, maybe you could give some examples of what they can be used for.
Yeah, correct. We just did a presentation on this at our last board meeting on the 8th of March. So purchasing hundreds of Chromebooks to help students or facilitate online learning, hotspots, thousands of dollars in cleaning supplies because of the disinfecting and things that needed to be done. The possibilities of having to use those funds for additional staff members to help out with learning gaps and things that end up emerging as a result of the pandemic. So those funds are to be allocated for that and would not be an appropriate use to pay down debt from the referendum that was passed in November.
Okay, thank you. We have some comments to everybody I'm speaking. These comments will be read, but I don't see questions other than how do you justify the building referendum? These are statements about taxes and increases and things like that. So I do want to talk a little bit about the size of the auditorium. The question specifically was, they wanted to ask about how the size of the auditorium was determined. Why not phases to the seating? We have multiple gyms. Again, a comment, not a question, I don't think. Building an auditorium for pep rallies is a question. I think that's what you said, Jordan, and what was shown was there were several potential uses for the auditorium. So I'm going to refer people back to the presentation to see those uses. But the question inside of this comment is, why not phase in the auditorium, especially the seating? And I don't know if Jim or Chris want to handle how that would work, if that could work. How did you determine the size of the auditorium?
Well, and I can address the phasing. I guess the concern with phasing the seating is the seats are, while they're relatively expensive, not by far the most expensive part. By the time you build the building around where the seating will go, at that point the seats are relatively cheap. If you're really trying to cut down dollars, obviously the building needs to get smaller. Unfortunately, with an auditorium, the way that they're designed, there's not a good way to build half of the seating now. So you build 250 seats now and then expand it to 500, just because of all the systems that are there, the sound, the lighting, and just how the layout functions with the sound booth and light booth in the back and the vestibules and everything else. It's not an easy, at least really strongly feasible way to, like a gym, you can almost tack on a second court. It's not something as easy to do in an auditorium.
Thank you. I'm going to just quickly peruse through here, make sure I hit the gist of the questions, or if anyone else has some questions, I'd like to. Here's one about school funding. Will additional school funding from the state may impact Heights by 11 million. I'm not sure if this is accurate. I'm going to refer to Jordan. Will additional school funding from state proposed funding formulas, which may impact Heights by 11 million, and any federal stimulus money be used to pay down debt? So we talked about the federal stimulus. So now would there be any funding from state sources for this?
Yeah, I guess I can't answer that question because we're in the middle of a budget and a biennium right now where our Democratic governor put out some budget priorities, but then the Republicans who control the legislators, the legislative body, excuse me, have come back and said that they are going to start with the base budget and not use the governor's proposal. So the words that I hear, or the things that I hear out of the State House from the lobbyist for our professional organization, is that we're in for a relatively interesting budget cycle where the politics will certainly be heavily involved. So I've certainly seen the proposals from Governor Evers, and those proposals like they would benefit all school districts in the state of Wisconsin, because he's talking about infusing significant state dollars into public education. They would certainly benefit the Wisconsin Heights School District. And if those things came to fruition, those things could potentially free up operational dollars to then be used to apply and pay down additional debt. The other thing, I talked about before, the fact that operational referendum, unlike what had happened over the last decade where the referendum grew steadily, the fact that we kept that at the same dollar amount for 5 years, the notion that we'll continue to be able to operate on the same amount of dollars for 5 years when there's inflationary increases for everything, insurance, utilities, things like that. Obviously, as a district, we're going to have to find ways. And if the state budget provided more funding, that would certainly help. So even though it would appear like a guy would be flush with cash, some of those things are going to have to go to just the economics of it all. And the fact that $2.2 million in 2019-20 is not the exact same as it's going to be 4 years later. But yes, if those things all came through, that would certainly be positive for the school district. And that would be something where those dollars could be used to help pay down the debt faster than we initially projected.
Okay. There are quite a few questions about state funding, and perhaps Jordan, that's getting a little off the subject of the referendum. The gist of the questions was, how would state funding affect the building project? I think we've answered that. There's questions about COVID relief. There's questions about state funding and all kinds of other fundraising and all that. Maybe we'll handle that in a FAQ on your website as well. I just feel as if this time should be about the referendum that's being presented, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, and like I said, I wouldn't know what else to say regarding the state budget other than what I just said. To speculate how that's going to turn out this summer and then what that's going to mean for us for the next, even couple years, let alone the 20 years over the life of the borrowing. That would be an incredibly high level of speculation and
right.
Estimates that would be
right.
difficult to make.
I think the question on the ballot is specifically about funding the auditorium and giving the district permission to borrow that money. And the slide had all the assumptions built into that, the interest rate, the 20-year term, and then the clarifying fact that you could not borrow more, that it'd have to be only for what it is that you're asking. So I'm going to respectfully submit to you, Jordan, and to the audience that other funding questions might be summarized in an FAQ on the website in the next few days. But for tonight's meeting, the question is on the ballot asking for $7.5 million in the borrowing is explained on the slide in this presentation. I have a question about what are the benefits of the auditorium and what are for the students, and then what would be the disadvantages to the students if it is not built? So educational programming benefits and disadvantages if you do not have it.
Well, I mean, I think to go back through when we mentioned anticipated district uses, I had counted up, there were 36 items that were presented or were shared by staff members for potential district use. So 36 is a relatively significant number. Having, as I mentioned before, and not to sound like a broken record, but having come from a district where I was a middle school, high school principal that was of similar size to Wisconsin Heights in central Wisconsin and had a 500-seat auditorium, I saw the benefits to having it as a principal on numerous occasions for our students. I mean, the clear one, the obvious one is students that are involved in things like the music program, forensics, drama, being able to perform on an actual stage and in an auditorium, things where the acoustics are good. It's a good environment for the audience. I mean, I would say even from our community's perspective, having been to some of the productions here at Wisconsin Heights, sitting in folding chairs in the cafeteria has served the district well since 1965. At the same time, I don't know that any of us look around in that environment and say like this is the type of pristine environment that we aspire to have our children or our community, utilize. So, I mean, I think really those things are, you can't understate the value that it has. But I think the other thing is sometimes there, like anything, the focus would be, well, if it was a gym, well, people are just going to want to talk about athletics and like, this is all about athletics. In the case of an auditorium, it's, well, this is only about the arts. No, it definitely is a huge asset to the fine arts community and to those students and those families in our community. But this is also going to benefit all the students. I mean, a lot of those programs we talked about were elementary programs, things where all of our students would be involved in some way, shape, or form, and kids getting in there for assemblies, getting in there for other classes. I mean, there's a lot of benefits to it, and that's certainly not to downplay the investment. But yeah, it certainly would be a very positive thing for the students of the school district.
Just a related question to funding, but directly related to the auditorium. Would there be any revenue generated by outside groups using the facilities? And if so, could that help pay off debt?
I mean, once again, I would say that's about like me trying to speculate on the state budget. It's a huge if. There may be, yes, having seen this play out in other districts, you will end up getting people from the community or traveling groups that will pay, hundreds of dollars potentially to rent the facility for a weekend for a production. So there certainly are some opportunities for revenue generation. It would probably also allow some of our groups to host events that they previously were not able to host, where they might be able to generate revenue as well. But to sit here and to say that we would generate so much revenue from this that we would be able to pay down debt, I don't want to speculate in that way. It'd be more realistic to say it would help pay for the operational cost rather than pay down the debt.
Thank you. Is there a possibility, again, not related to the referendum, but so there's a lot of questions about the various, the operating referendum and the elementary school and the auditorium kind of getting mixed into the questions. But is there a possibility that you would come back for a second operating referendum while this one is on the books still?
No, that has never entered into the discussion. the referendum was passed, the operational referendum was passed for 5 years. We had conversations that we did that knowing that there would be things that we would have to be intelligent about in the budgeting process. But at the same time, if we said we were going to use these dollars for 5 years, then we were going to stick to that. So no, I have never engaged in that conversation, and I have not heard anyone either administratively or on the school board engage in any conversation about the possibility of an additional referendum, operational referendum, before this one expires.
Lots of comments I'm looking for the questions, lots of comments in the chat. So pardon me while I read through to make sure I'm answering the questions. The comments can be read by throughout this. We're recording it, so the comments can be read by the superintendent and the board. Will social distancing guidelines impact the seating design work, Chris?
So short answer is no. I mean, by the time this is constructed, we're hoping that we'll be through the pandemic. We'll be designing this as more of a traditional theater seating. If we have to get through another one of these, obviously we do what most schools are doing, and is just closing certain seats off. But this would not be built in a time that until hopefully we're through this current pandemic.
What specific communities are you talking about, and what business base do they have to donate and support financially through utilizing the space? I guess, Jordan, it's just a question about what other communities have auditoriums, and how do businesses support those auditoriums? Do you have any specific examples? That might be just too big of a question. It's not related directly to our referendum, but maybe a clarifying if you have any specifics.
You know, I mean, the last district that I worked in, as I mentioned, was the Edgar School District. I don't know if that's what this is getting at. In terms of specific to our community, as I mentioned before, I've been brought up to speed from community members who are very much, excited about this possibility, who have been in contact with businesses, but that has not been something that I personally have been engaged in, or that, as far as I know, school leaders have been engaged in, because we're trying to focus our efforts on sharing the information relative to the referendum, and not speculating what those things might look like depending on the outcome of the referendum. But there are certainly a number of districts, in our area. Sauk is one that comes up a lot in terms of an auditorium space, and what that brings to the community, and what that partnership looks like between the community and the school district. That is an example that has been brought up, or been brought to my attention on multiple occasions.
So I think we're at we're at 6:28. If there is one more question that would be clarifying about the auditorium, we'd have time for it. In the meantime, I'm going to look through here to see if there are any that we haven't answered. Again, there are several comments. And those will be read. I have one new message. I guess the question is, can this auditorium be built with donations? And I think we talked about that earlier. If there's no approved project, there isn't a project to fundraise for. Is that accurate, Jordan?
Yeah, I would say that's an accurate statement.
In closing, I think it's important for everybody to cast an informed vote. That is what this is about tonight. And I'd like to thank everybody who joined us. We had 43 participants. At one point, we had 46. It's important that you ask your questions and leave your comments. It does help the board and Jordan understand what's on the minds of the community. If you need information about the logistics of voting, myvotewisconsin.gov is an excellent resource. It answers all the questions. So if you or anyone you know needs to register or know how to vote either in person or absentee, this is a resource we like to direct everybody to. With that, Jordan, do you have any closing comments? It is 6:30.
Nope, I just want to thank people for their time. I greatly appreciate the time and the feedback. And as Doreen mentioned, we will have a copy of the questions and things in the chat. So those will be things that we can take a look at and gladly will share with the school board as well. But just really appreciate your time and your engagement and wish everyone a great rest of your night. And thank you for your time. So thank you very much and take care.
Good night.